Welcome to Travel Italia, the show about travel in Italy. Ciao tutti, welcome to Travel Italia, the podcast about traveling in Italy. Today's podcast is part 2 in my series about Lake Como. In part 1, I talked about Lake Como in general, about its two biggest cities, Como and Lecco, and some of its history. In today's episode, I'll share with you some important details about when to visit the lake, which time of the year is best, how to get to the lake, and once you're there, how to get around the lake. You know, one of the reasons I started this podcast is to answer questions that I get very, very often. Today, I'll be talking about 3 questions that I frequently get asked when people ask about Lake Como, which are, what month should I visit? How do I get there? And once I'm there, how do I get around the lake? So let's get started. As I mentioned in my previous episode, Lake Como has become one of the top destinations in Italy. So in the last decade, there's been a steady increase in tourism at the lake. This past summer of 2023, saw the most tourists ever to visit Lake Como. It was a record breaker. I think part of the reason for record numbers was pent-up demand and desire to travel after the pandemic, obviously. Summer of 2023 was the first summer since the pandemic in which Italy didn't require travelers to prove they've been vaccinated. All the restrictions were dropped, so naturally droves of people took advantage of the situation and traveled to Italy, and lots of those folks went to Lake Como. So let's talk about what months are best to visit Lake Como. As you're planning and thinking about your future trip, I'm sure you've thought about this question. Well, summer, especially late June, July, and early August, are what are considered peak season at the lake. During peak season, you'll find prices are generally higher. There are crowds of people crammed onto the ferry boats that take you from town to town along the lake. And the lake's beautiful little sleepy villages get swarmed with tourists. Of course, it's a beautiful time of year to be at the lake. You can cool off in the water, sip a spritz as you watch the sunset, and admire the stars as you enjoy a delicious gelato. But if you're not into crowds, I would avoid these months altogether. I know that some people can't avoid traveling during the summer because of school schedules or what have you. So if you have to travel in the summer, I suggest you travel in early June or the last week of August, which are the shoulder times of the peak summer season. My personal favorite season to be at the lake is spring. I love spring at the lake because there are so many beautiful historic villas that have gorgeous gardens. And these gardens, like Villa Carlotta, Villa Monastero, or Villa Balbinello, these are some of the most famous ones, are spectacular when their gardens are in full bloom. During spring, you won't be alone at the lake. There'll of course, be tourists, but there'll be much fewer tourists than in summer. I recommend April and May. March can still be cold and a little gray, so it's not an ideal time to visit. And remember that part of the highlight of visiting Lake Como, at least in my opinion, is visiting these historic villas. And so if that's on your list of things to do, it's better to visit during spring or summer. Well, what about winter? Well, I wouldn't recommend going to the lake in winter because many of the hotels, historic villas, restaurants, and even some entire towns pretty much shut down for the winter. Italians take their work-life balance very seriously, which I really admire. So they have no problem shutting their businesses down for a few months at a time to take a break after a busy tourist season. I think it's great. Also, remember that the lake is near the Alps, so it gets really cold and very windy in winter, and not exactly an ideal time to visit. Fall is a nice time to visit the lake, especially early fall. I would recommend September and early October because the temperatures are still pretty mild. But by mid October, the temps start to drop, foliage starts to turn, and it gets rainy and colder. So I hope these details help you decide as you're planning your visit to the lake. Now let's turn our attention to how to get to the lake. As I mentioned in the previous episode, Lake Como is about 50 kilometers from downtown Milan. If you're flying in, the closest city with major airports is Milan, obviously. Milan has two major airports, Malpensa and Linate. When you're booking flights, please pay attention to which airport you're arriving at because they're on opposite sides of the city. Malpensa is fully outside and north of the city. Malpensa is about a 45-minute drive from the city of Como, and Linate is about an hour drive. From Malpensa Airport, you can take a train to the town of Como. Another option besides the train is a taxi, private transfer, or Uber Black, which could cost upwards of 130 euro. Just a quick note about Uber in Italy. Uber only operates in the Milan area, which includes Lake Como and Rome. And only Uber Black is available in these two areas. You can take an Uber Black, for example, from Malpensa Airport to the city of Como for about 120 euros. If you want to save some money, then I would really consider taking the train. I'll give you an example. A train ride from Malpensa Airport to the lakefront of the city of Como takes about an hour and 18 minutes, and it only costs 11 euro and 10 cents. That's a deal. In the show notes, I'll add the link to the official Italian rail system and the name of the train station in Como, which leaves you right at the waterfront. If you're coming from another part of Italy by train, you'll most likely need to change trains in Milan. And if you're coming from Switzerland, you can take a train south right into the city of Como. Because like I mentioned in episode 1, it's right on the Swiss border. So once you've arrived at the lake, let's say you took a train to the city of Como, what then? How do you get from one side of the lake to the other? So to get around the lakes, you have different options. Let's remember that the most popular area of the lake is the central area where Bellagio, Varenna, Cernobo, and Tremezzo are located. As you're planning your trip, I would pull up Google Maps and take a look at where it is you want to be. If you're going to be in that central area, then where Como is and where Lecco is, just to get your bearings as you navigate your way around the lake, because it's really an enormous lake. So what I'm going to focus on in your options is how to get from the city of Como to that central area, Bellagio, Varenna, Cernobbio, and Tremezzo, because I'm just going to use that as an example. You may be staying somewhere else on the lake, but just because that seems to be the most popular place to be, I'll use that as an example. So option 1 is, of course, driving. That is, if you're brave enough. There's a 2-lane road that runs along the entire lake. It's a little hairy in some places, as the road is extremely narrow and in some spots even more narrow. But it is one of the most breathtaking, scenic car rides ever. Remember, the lake is huge, so getting from one side of the lake to the other takes some time. So from Como to Bellagio, it takes about an hour by car. And like I said, it is a spectacular drive, but for my taste, the roads are just a little bit too narrow. And the other thing about these roads, the road, because really it's only one main road that goes around the lake, that it is a world famous cycling haven. So, in case you didn't know that, Lake Como is just heaven for cyclists. So, as you're driving, you have to share the road with, tour buses and Dodge cyclists all over the place. So, just keep that in mind. Option number 2 is the ferry system. There's a ferry system that you can use to get around the lake. From the city of Como, you can hop on a ferry to get you to Bellagio, and that will take about an hour and 45 minutes. I have to tell you that this ferry ride is a fantastic way to see the lake because it allows you to see all the gorgeous, historic lakeside villas and hotels that you just can't see from the road because the road is above the lake, not at lake level. The ferry makes stops at most of the lakeside towns, but not all of them. The cost of taking a ferry from Como to Bellagio is only 10 euros and 40 cents, and that's a deal. And using the ferry system to get around the lake is great. I mean, it's a great option. You can also buy unlimited ticket for the day, and this will allow you to get on and off the ferry at any town on the lake for the entire day. These tickets cost at the most 28 euro per person per day. That's a great way to spend the day once you arrive at the lake, is to spend the day visiting all the towns that you want and for one really low price. They also have a 6-day unlimited ferry pass, and that costs 84 euro. So if you're there for a week or so, it's definitely worth buying. But here's the problem with the ferry system. Each ferry stop has a little ticket office with a ferry schedule posted in the window and usually run by just a couple of employees, maybe 1 or 2 people. But in the summertime, the lines to buy tickets, especially at the city of Como ferry landing, are outrageously long. And the whole process is confusing and irritating, in my opinion. At the Como ferry station in the summertime and on weekends, it's not uncommon to see an enormous line of people waiting in the sun, for an hour or so just to buy tickets. So here's my pro tip on how to avoid long lines and avoid wasting your precious vacation time. Buy your tickets in advance online. In the show notes, I'll put the link to the official lake ferry system. But be aware that this one company and website runs all the ferries for all the big Italian northern lakes. So Lake Maggiore, Lake Garda, and Lake Como. So for the 3 big lakes in northern Italy. So as you're buying tickets, make sure you buy tickets for the right lake. And I tell you this because it's not that clear on the website. So just be sure. You can navigate the site in English if you click on the language drop-down menu in the upper right corner of the homepage. Once you purchase your tickets, you'll get an email, and this will tell you which corsa number your ferry is. So corsa just means route. If you're at the ferry station in the city of Como, there are different departure points, different docks. There's not just one dock. I think there's like three docks at least, and maybe more. So all you have to do is find the right dock, And there is information, I believe they have info at each dock to show you which route is coming, which one's arriving, which one's departing. So you don't have to stand in the long, long line to buy your tickets. And I wouldn't stand in that line to get information either. I would just find your dock. You don't not so sure, flag down someone on the docks and ask, because it is just a really great way to save money, to save time. A word of caution about these tickets: they are not reservations. You don't get an assigned seat. And it doesn't even guarantee you a seat, unfortunately, or a spot. If the ferry is full when you get there, you just have to wait for the next one. So on that same website, you can look at the ferry schedule. And unfortunately, you might want to study the ferry schedule because it is a little confusing, but once you get the hang of it, it's no problem. So if you are there in the high season, it pays to be at the dock before your scheduled departure time so that you get a spot. Okay, so again, I'll put the link in the show notes for the ferry website because it is an absolute huge time saver. All right, on to option 3. Option 3 is taking a public bus. There are bus routes that run along the lake. You can use apps like Move It or Roam to Rio to find routes and schedules, and it's very inexpensive, very cheap, just a few euros. But the downside is that you can't buy a ticket online. In Italy, there is this weird system of buying bus tickets at tabaquerias. What is a tabaqueria? It is a weird tobacco shop where they sell tobacco and bus tickets, and you can pay your bills there. It's just kind of a weird multi-purpose place that doesn't exist in the US. So the problem is that you have to find one of these and buy your tickets before you get on the bus. And unfortunately, they don't let you buy tickets once you are on the bus. You have to have a ticket in hand. So it's a bit inconvenient and logistically inconvenient if you are lugging around suitcases. So not my favorite way to travel around the lake, but it is an option. Option number 4 is the train. On the West Fork, the train line ends at the city of Como. But on the East Fork, the train line continues all the way up the length of the lake. So, for example, if you're in Milan and you want to visit Varenna, which is one of the most popular towns on the East Fork of the lake, in that central area that I mentioned, you can take a train from Milano Centrale, that's the name of the main station in Milan, and you can go directly to Varenna nonstop. It takes just an hour and 4 minutes, and get this, it only costs €7.40. A deal, right? The train station, once you get there, is just a 10-minute walk from the heart of Varenna. I think less than 10 minutes, and I would say like 8, but I've never timed myself. And from there, you can explore this beautiful little village, and if you want to get on a ferry, you can do so because there's a ferry station in Varenna. So you can take a short ferry to get over to Bellagio. You can get over to Menaggio, anywhere else on the lake by just jumping on a ferry. So it's a great option. And the train ride is super scenic because the route hugs the lakefront. So it's beautiful, very beautiful. Now on to option number 5. Option number 5 is for those of you who don't need to worry about budgeting. Option number 5 is a taxi boat. Now, there are many different companies on the lake and they have fluctuating prices, so I can't give you an exact price. But know that a boat taxi can mean anything from a simple motorboat to like a James Bond style beautiful wooden boat that costs €200 an hour. So for those of you that money is no concern, go for it and enjoy the ride on one of these gorgeous boats. But for others who are on a budget, I would say save this kind of trip and make it a special event, rather than just taking it from point A to point B. There are taxi boat tours available, and these are really fantastic. And they're gorgeous. I'm not kidding when I say James Bond style boats. They really are. And it's a fantastic experience. It's kind of like if you're in Venice, you have to do the gondolas. If you're in Lake Como, one of these boat rides, it should be on the top of your list if your budget allows you, because like I said, they are expensive. In the next episode, I'll talk more about these taxi boat tours and give you some recommendations. But for now, I've summed up what months are best to travel to Lake Como, how to get to the lake, and once you're there, how to get around the lake. I hope this episode has been helpful to you. If it has been, please rate the show and share it with your travel buddies. Check out the show notes for those links I mentioned and stay tuned for the next episode about Lake Como, where I'll give you tons of ideas of what there is to see and do at the lake. Thank you so much for your time. I wish you a buon viaggio.